I'm working at the main Edible Acres nursery yesterday and today, and I thought it'd be really nice to give a spring update here as we enter the beginning of the 10th year of this being a food forest. It's pretty exciting to have. It's still a very young system in many ways, but now there's some pretty well established trees doing their thing, so I'd like to walk around and show you what's going on in early spring at a 10-year-old food forest. The beauties we're looking at here, this friend and that larger one, are both Siberian apricots planted in the spring of 2009, so they are now 10 years old. And as long as we don't get a heavy frost, we should be looking at a few thousand small but very delicious apricots from them this year. Both seedlings, and so I've been growing children of them from seed, and really productive, beautiful beings, one of the first flowers in the early spring. And exciting part about having a system that's at this age is now we've been growing their children out, and this will be the first year one of their kids will be making their first crop, so we get to see what the flavor is like. Is it very much like the parents? Does it drift dramatically? So it's pretty exciting to have them naturalizing in the landscape now. We have about 50 planted out. Another absolute showstopper here is the Nanking Cherry. At this point, we have grandchildren of them from the first plantings put in at the beginning of 2009. And this one here on the north side of the garage is actually probably one of the most flower-laden ones we have on the property. It's absolutely gorgeous, incredible browse for bees early in the spring, and tons of fruit in July. The Fuki is just wrapping up its flowering and starting to put on its huge leaves. And of course, like every year, it spreads and spreads and spreads, so we harvest them to sell or to move to other areas so we can keep our walkways open. Underneath these apricots, we've got a Beech Plum, which I think this is the year I'm definitively learning it is not a shade-tolerant being. It's never made a good crop under the shade of this apricot. However, these service berries, we've got a couple different varieties here, both primed to set flower in the next few weeks. So they come after the Nanking Cherry and the apricots. Beautiful flowers, really sweet smelling, and a stellar fruit. Behind this apricot, just to the north of it, is an 11-year-old precocious hazel, which has both a huge number of male catkins and lots of female flowers. Looks like it's going to be a great year for hazelnuts. That one is pollinated with a few in this area, proving that they are pretty darn shade tolerant. At some point I'll do a more thorough inventory of what's happening in all these guilds, but suffice it to say it's pretty complex. There's Carpathian walnuts and plums and apricots, sea buckthorn, red currants, all sorts of fun beings in there. Inside these little cages are a new variety of quince and medlar that I'm excited to be trying to grow out. And you can see where I'm setting up these new air prune bed systems. Those two boxes are planted out to persimmons, and over time I'll fill this whole area. I got to keep on top of the Fuki. This is one area where if it creeps into here, it'll actually rob these beds. You can see back in the shade in there, it's doing incredibly well. Even with an overstory of all these larch and spruce to the north, there's enough sun and enough access that a tremendous amount of diversity and production can happen here right next to the lawn. Just finished up building the second raised bed for my mom over here, so this area is now dialed in right next to the home, and so we'll see how that evolves over time. You can see Nanking cherries just boop, 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 all over. Most of them I planted, but actually a fair number are random sports that popped up and we just worked around them, and here they are, beautiful. Here's a peach guild with sweet Sicily and tulips as an understory. Really enjoying all that extra light before the peach leafs out. This is another one that, so long as we don't get an intense freeze, should have hundreds of peaches from this tree this year. Just to the south of it, I pruned it back a bit, and I probably will need to prune it back some more, is a very happy Chickasaw Plum. It's a wild native plum that suckers in thicket forms. Probably a week or so this will be loaded with flowers. It just fills the air when they flower. It's a pretty wonderful being. that way, you can see how many. There would be thousands of flowers on this in about a week or so. I went through and pruned back very, very hard a male hardy kiwi that was growing on this Chinese chestnut. Last year this chestnut made around 50 or so nuts. This year it should make a lot more. And it was being used as a trellis for hardy kiwi, which is definitely not a good design in the long run. So I've cut this kiwi back pretty hard, and I'll pin it to the ground and stool it so that in the fall I can get a number of rooted divisions, move them onto a proper trellis, and then maybe dig this up entirely. So you learn as you go. More Nanking cherries as understory. In this little thicket, we've got a Nanking on the west side, Dunbar's plum in there, which will be flowering hopefully alongside the Chickasaw plum for good pollination, and then a real high density mini pawpaw thicket. There's a cherry that popped in here, but I'll leave it for now. There's probably 4 or 5 pawpaws and a whole bunch of daffodils underneath. Really beautiful little site. And in this little space where the old stump of the pine was, looks like an Osage Orange found its way in here, as well as an oak, as well as a mulberry. And I've got a whole pile of little seedling pawpaws growing in the deep, deep shade, and they seem to be happy enough. Right next to the house here, we've got a huge Potomac Pear. And those of you that do proper pruning and management probably look at this and think I'm wacky. I could have pruned this and shaped this much better than I did, but just letting it be a huge being, and it drops these rock-hard, beautiful pears in the fall. Did some very intense pruning in here to cut back the 2 honey locusts that I planted in 2011. They were about 25 feet tall. Last year they resprouted from the pollarding that I did. Very interesting observation. I'd love to hear if other folks have seen this. These were seedlings that I grew out from thornless parents, and for their whole life growing here they were 100% thornless. When I pollarded them last year, the new growth has thorns. Pretty interesting. I gotta watch that one closely. If it gets very thorny, it won't be compatible to be here in the long run. But the idea is right now, there's some gooseberries underneath it, there's big root geranium growing in there, and this spring I'll probably plant some grapevines that I can manage on this honey locust as a trellis. Sasha and I did most of the harvest the other day, probably about 20 plus pounds. The first big spring flush of cold weather shiitakes happened. And even though this yard is pretty abandoned and poorly managed overall, and there are dead logs, some of the logs in here from 2009, 2011, even with all that, we're still getting many tens of pounds when they flush. You can see just one old log here, half of its bark missing, and yet it's still loaded with shiitakes. We've found that with the cold weather strains, which fruit naturally when they're ready, inoculating larger logs with them and then laying them out in crib stack that's open so you can get your hands through is really quite nice, because then we never have to move these logs. We just come in and reach. The other day when we harvested here, it was stunning just how many fruits there were. We're letting these smaller ones, we'll see if they ripen up a little bit further or if we need to harvest them sooner than later. Probably another 5-10 pounds of mushrooms to get in the next week or so. Looking from the east at what was the main garden, and still is in some ways, but now that the fence has been broken, the rabbits and deer get in there, so it's been challenging trying to figure out how to manage that space, but it's still loaded with a tremendous number of great plants. There's some more hazelnuts over here. Carpathian walnut is just such a beauty when it's young, and a beauty when it's old too. I actually this weekend, or the last few days, planted out about 50 more into the landscape here, mainly on the north edge of the property. They seem to love it here. And having stinging nettles as a carpet ground cover underneath them is really nice. They get a ton of light in the early spring before the walnut leaves out, and we've been harvesting from this. In fact, my lunch today was shiitakes from the logs with stinging nettles and garlic greens and some sauerkraut. It's quite nice. Tons of complexity, herbaceous understory, ground covers. There's rhubarb and never bolting sorrel. We had skirret growing in here, and the pathway is flanked with black currants on our way into this main garden. This area is a little bit less nicely managed than I'd like, but we'll get back to it. I had a white mulberry in here that was getting too big, and so I cut it to the ground in the hopes that this spring it'll re-sprout and we can stool layer it and get rooted cuttings, because the fruit is quite lovely, but it cannot be a full-size tree in here. Likewise, these locusts, this will be the year that I cut these supposedly shipmast locusts down to the ground and have them coppice. It doesn't look too shipmasty to me, so we'll have to see if I got a dud or what. Siberian pea shrubs are waking up in here. The bees are buzzing and life is teeming. Again, those Nankings, man, what a beauty. The showstoppers this time of year. All throughout the garden, most of these planted by mice over time. And I would just dig up some and leave a few. And in fact, all of the seedlings that we're trying to grow out at this point are coming from this mother plant. It's the largest one I've seen, and the fruit is excellent. So fingers crossed we have a good year. Last year we had complete decimation from rabbits. A strange and incredibly beautiful sea kale new growth is emerging in between the winter-dried prickly pear cactus. Those will perk up and grow just fine in a bit. And the sea kale you can see where I dug through here to satisfy shipping orders. But that's actually very stimulating, and so long as I don't keep disturbing the soil, all those root fragments will sprout, and this will be a carpet of thick purple leaves soon enough. Back in here, the sea kale is sharing space with a whole bunch of perennial Chinese medicinal herbs. Here's some honeyberries. Their flowers are actually opening up too. This year we ordered 5 new named varieties, so we can try some more Japanese types. These are the ones that flower very early, and the fruit is on the tart side, but quite nice. It's a great spring browse for bees, and the fruit will be ripe probably a week before strawberry season. The garden gets absolutely insane in here in some spots, but at least it's filled with a tremendous amount of diversity and perennial high value, high medicinal, high flavor plant. So the question is, am I next dormant window in the fall going to come through and try to dig all this out and start from scratch? Or I think more likely I'm just going to plant in more trees and more shrubs and forgo having this be a nursery space that I dig and allow it to evolve into the later succession food forest that it wants to be. It's the path of least resistance, and there's so many moving parts, it's hard to keep a space like this in check. Right in the middle of the lawn here is one of the more dense and complex gardens that we have, probably about 15 feet by 30 feet or 40 feet, and with so much diversity it's absolutely ridiculous, and everybody seems to do pretty well in here. Rhubarb on the edge is a rhizome barrier and a nutrient accumulator for everyone else. A whole bunch of cultivar collection, blackberry or blackcurrant, white currant, and red currant in here. This elderberry, we cut a whole lot for shipping cuttings to folks this winter, and it'll re-sprout like mad this spring. I've been focusing more energy on this space because it proved to be fully rabbit-proof this last winter, which is very helpful. That hardware cloth around the bottom, it was not inexpensive, but it really has been serving well. And so everywhere you see bare soil, I need to get some mulch on it, but this probably has about 300 peach seeds, and those beds have hundreds of hazelnut, peach, and pawpaw. And you can see I've also taken cuttings of different cultivar elders. So this is a propagation space where I will be keeping it open so that I can grow out different cultivars and then dig them each fall. But to my eye, and probably to yours as well, that bare soil is kind of harsh looking, so we're expecting a heavy rain tomorrow, and then I'm going to prioritize getting a very deep mulch on here again. Over here at the southern hedgerow, The pond systems are at peak right now. That metal tube, I gotta figure something out. That's pretty ugly. But the ponds have been holding water well. I put some overwintered duckweed into each one. You can see a little thump of it over there. So they'll be covering the surface of the water very soon. We're hoping more frogs wake up. I'm seeing mosquito larvae, so ecologically the frogs need to get their act together, and it seems like each year they do. This pond is almost completely filled with water celery, very powerful plant loving aquatic spaces, and there's some water iris growing in there as well, and a hybrid poplar that I stuck in the pond maybe 8 years ago. It absolutely loves being there. I think I'll save the rest of this edge space, this pond and pocket and lump space, for another video. It's evolving really nicely, and the woodies are starting to come into their own in here, and I'd like to do more spaces like this. Just as a side note, I've been using what I thought was a dead mushroom log as a little bridge to cross this waterway when I was using wheelbarrows, and even though the log is almost completely broken apart, it's still making mushrooms. Pretty funny to have a bridge provide you lunch. So that's a rambling walk of the main garden and production spaces that are within 50 yards or so of the home here. Still a lot more cleaning up to do, lots more mulch needed now that the sun is starting to beat on that bare soil, and doing a little bit of weeding here or there, but these systems are so packed and so diverse, they actually fill in with themselves quite nicely. So I'll leave it here for now. If there are particular areas you saw from this that were compelling and you wanted more information, let me know. I'd be happy to do more detailed videos on certain aspects. But this is a quick view, a long view of a now 10-year-old food forest starting to really come into its own. We'll be doing workshops and tours and open houses and potted plant sales throughout the season, so keep your eyes peeled for that on our Facebook page and through our email list. We'd love to see you in person. Maybe it works, there's a summer vacation and you happen to be in our area, and we could see all these crazy things in real life. But for now, thanks for watching, and hope you're having a wonderful start to your growing season.